About a decade or so ago, I worked at a well-known retail chain in the US. Its slogan about saving money and living better would make it obvious to most Americans which store I'm referring to. The store had recently undergone renovations, and there was an odd feeling in the air afterward. It was originally constructed in 2007, but the land it stood on had a long and eerie history. A Dutch settlement, then an English colony, a pirate hideout, and later a conservation project. But the part of its past that stood out most was that the area had been used as a massive dumping ground for decades, long before World War II. It was a landfill for all kinds of waste, from debris from bombed-out London buildings during the war to hazardous materials like mercury and other toxic chemicals in the 60s. And, of course, bodies. In 2002, while constructing an additional highway exit leading to a train station, workers uncovered over 4,000 remains. These were part of a forgotten burial ground, used for those who had died in poverty or were patients in mental institutions back in the 19th century. These were the only documented discoveries, but given the site's history, who knows how many more unmarked graves remain beneath the surface. But enough about that. During my time working there, I encountered multiple incidents that suggested something paranormal was at play. A shadowy figure was spotted in the automotive department by a maintenance worker I knew. Products would tumble off the shelves when no one was nearby. The rolling doors in the stockroom would open on their own. Sometimes, people reported hearing a sneeze from inside one of the refrigerated coolers, even when they were in there alone. Many of these occurrences could be dismissed. Items falling? Maybe they weren't properly placed. Shadows? Probably a trick of the light. But the rolling doors, that was harder to explain. These doors only opened via buttons located on either side, and they had sensors to prevent them from shutting on someone. However, these sensors weren't designed to open the door once it was already fully closed. Yet, on multiple occasions, I saw them roll up on their own. The first time, I had just heard a sneeze from inside and went to check, only to find no one there. Maybe someone had sneezed nearby, but it felt too coincidental. For a long time, I brushed off these incidents. That was until one night, when I experienced something that I couldn't explain away. I was working the overnight shift, stocking shelves and prepping for the morning rush. I had just finished unloading merchandise and was looking for my coworkers, let's call them J and M, to help bring out TVs from the back. Just as I turned to head toward the stockroom, I saw Jay standing a few aisles away, watching me. Perfect timing, man. I was just about to look for you, I called out with a grin. But Jay didn't respond. He just turned away and started walking toward the stockroom. I was confused and a little annoyed. I knew he had heard me. The store was quiet except for the low music playing in the electronics section. Even if he somehow hadn't, he should have seen me talking. I called after him again and started following, but he ignored me, keeping a steady pace ahead. He wasn't far, maybe 20 feet ahead, so I never lost sight of him, even though he was taller and walked faster than I did. When he turned the corner toward the stockroom, I followed just seconds later, but he was gone. The double doors weren't even swinging, meaning they hadn't just been pushed open. I shoved them aside and stepped in, expecting to see him inside, but he was nowhere to be found. Annoyed, I decided to check the storage area where the TVs were kept. If he had gone back there, I was going to call him out for ignoring me. As I approached, I heard voices, J and M, talking casually. As I turned the corner, I saw them in the middle of moving TVs. M was reaching for one while J handed it down from the top shelf of the 20-foot storage racks. What the hell? I blurted out. What? M asked, adjusting his glasses as he set a TV down. J perched on the shelf, swinging his legs, waiting for me to explain. My brain struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no way he could have climbed up there that quickly. Not in the time between me losing sight of him and stepping into the back room. It was impossible. How long have you been back here? I asked, trying to piece it together. Jay thought for a moment. Not sure. We've put away about 5 pallets of TVs, so maybe 30 minutes. And you've both been back here this whole time? I nodded. Yeah, why? I exhaled sharply and ran a hand through my hair before explaining what had just happened. How I had seen Jay, spoken to him, followed him, only for him to vanish. "Are you sure it looked like me?" Jay asked, scratching his cheek. "Of course I'm sure," I snapped. "It's not like there's someone else here who looks exactly like you." Jay stood up, shaking his head. "Well, I've been up here the whole time. I haven't left." "A ghost," Em murmured, leaning against the shelf. I glanced around. I had heard people say the store was haunted, and I'd witnessed weird things myself, but this was different. "I know the area has a crazy history," Em continued. "Maybe it's something tied to the land." He wasn't wrong. An older coworker, who had lived in the area for decades, often spoke about its dark past. If you've ever seen The Sopranos, you might get an idea of what I mean. While nothing has ever been proven, the rumors have been around for years. I nodded, deciding to let the topic drop and focus on the task at hand. But even as we moved the rest of the TVs, my mind kept replaying the encounter. There was no way Jay had made it to the storage racks before me. No way he could have climbed up without me noticing. And the look on both their faces when I told them, they weren't playing around. They were just as confused as I was. Years have passed since then, and while I've seen odd things happen in the store, nothing has come close to that night. As more people joined the team and the store grew busier, the strange occurrences became less frequent. But sometimes, when it's quiet, I still hear soft whispers or see something move out of the corner of my eye. The store is undergoing another renovation now, just like before. So far, nothing out of the ordinary has happened, but if history repeats itself, who knows? Maybe it's just a matter of time. This happened a few summers back when I was visiting my folks. I had moved out for college 3 years earlier, but I still spent my summers there. It was a 4-month break, and at one point, my parents left to visit my older sister in another city. That meant I'd be alone at the house. My parents also owned a cabin about 5 hours away by car. They had bought it after I moved out, so I wasn't too familiar with the place. I had only visited a few times and had never been there by myself before. I asked my parents if I could stay at the cabin instead of the house since I figured it would be more interesting. They agreed, so that's what I did. My parents left on a Saturday morning, and I headed to the cabin that afternoon. When I arrived, there was still some daylight left, so I had time to settle in before bed. The cabin was pretty secluded and mostly off the grid. Running water was limited, and we still used the original outhouse from when the place was first built in the 1920s. The structure had wooden siding, making it look like a log cabin even though it wasn't. The front had a creaky wooden porch in need of repair. A plank on the left side was missing. My dad had plans to renovate parts of it, including upgrading the septic system, but he hadn't gotten around to it yet. The cabin was accessible by car, and the last stretch of road only led to our place, so there was no real reason for anyone else to be around. That being said, the road was decent unless it rained. The next afternoon, I was sitting in the living room when I heard a knock at the door. It startled me because I didn't think anyone else was in the area. The only people who knew I was there were my parents. When I looked outside, there was a man standing there who I didn't recognize. He looked a little rough but not outright dangerous. I cracked the door open and asked what he needed. I figured he might be a neighbor, and I didn't want to be rude. If it had been later in the evening, I probably wouldn't have opened the door at all. But since it was around 2 in the afternoon, I wasn't too concerned. I opened the door slightly wider but kept the screen door shut. As soon as I did, the man smiled and said he was lost and needed directions. Even though it seemed odd, I told him how to get back to the main road. It was basically a straight shot, but it would take him at least an hour on foot. That made me wonder how he had ended up out here in the first place. While we were talking, I noticed him glancing over my shoulder, looking into the cabin as if he was sizing it up. That made me uncomfortable, but after a short conversation, he turned around and walked off, heading down the only road out of there. I watched him until he disappeared. Even though it felt off, it wasn't enough to raise an alarm. The police wouldn't have been much help in a remote area like this, but my dad kept a gun in the bedroom for emergencies. He had even trained me on how to use it the first time I visited the cabin. I wasn't planning on using it, but knowing it was there was somewhat reassuring. That night, I was in the living room watching an old movie on VHS. As the film was coming to an end, I decided to go outside for a smoke. My parents would be able to tell if I smoked inside, so I had a usual spot out by a small clearing with a pond. I put on my shoes and headed out. It was around 10 at night, and the woods were pitch dark. I carried a flashlight with me, its beam cutting through the darkness. Once I reached my spot, I lit my cigarette and set the flashlight on the ground, angling it upward. It gave off just enough light for me to see a little. After a few minutes, I heard rustling in the trees. I immediately knew it was a person. Before I could react, someone stepped out of the woods, and it was the same man from earlier. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could, he lunged at me. My cigarette fell to the ground, landing near the flashlight. We struggled, and in the scuffle, I kicked the flashlight over, making it roll onto its side. The light now pointed away from us, and suddenly, everything was almost completely dark. The fight became a blur. I couldn't tell how badly I was being hit or if he had a weapon. I just fought back as hard as I could. Somehow, I managed to break free, grab my flashlight, and take off running back to the cabin. I got inside and locked the door behind me, my heart pounding. I had no idea how close behind me he was. Then I remembered the gun in the bedroom. I bolted for the dresser, grabbed it, and turned to face the doorway. My hands were shaking, and I wasn't even sure if it was loaded. I stopped to listen. That's when I heard footsteps inside the cabin. I shouted that I had a gun, but the man didn't say anything. The footsteps grew louder as he moved closer. Then he appeared in the doorway. I stood there, shaking, with the gun pointed at him. The man froze when he saw it. I yelled at him to leave. For a moment, I thought he might try to call my bluff. He took a step forward, and I shouted again, warning that I would shoot. That finally got through to him. He slowly backed away, keeping his eyes locked on me as he moved toward the door. I held my stance, the gun still raised. In reality, I wasn't prepared to fire, but if he had charged at me, I wouldn't have had a choice. He slipped out the front door and disappeared into the night. I stayed where I was, barely breathing, my hands still trembling. Finally, I lowered the gun and collapsed onto the bed, trying to steady my nerves. Less than a minute later, I sat up and looked at the gun. That's when I realized it wasn't even loaded. If I had needed to fire, it wouldn't have helped me at all. I knew I couldn't stay there. He might come back. I grabbed my phone, wallet, and car keys and slipped out the back door, making sure to lock it behind me. I ran to my car and drove straight to my parents' house in the middle of the night. When I got home, I felt a little safer, but my nerves were still on edge. Sleep wasn't an option. Even though morning was near, I decided to call the police. I explained what happened and gave them the cabin's address. They said they'd send an officer to check it out as soon as there was daylight. After hanging up, I called my parents. I hadn't wanted to ruin their trip, but they needed to know. My mom picked up, and I quickly told her everything. She was understandably upset and said they would cut their trip short to come home as soon as possible. For the next couple of hours, I paced the house, double-checking locks and peering out the windows, feeling like the man might have followed me. Later that morning, the police called back. They told me the cabin had been broken into. My parents didn't keep much of value there, but the place had been ransacked. They also found signs of a makeshift campsite near the property. When they asked if it was ours, I told them we only used the cabin itself. It seemed clear that the guy had been staying on the property for some time. When he realized I was alone, he saw an opportunity. He must have spotted my flashlight when I went outside and decided to make his move. After I got away, he must have fled, afraid of getting caught. That thought didn't make me feel much better. I never felt safe at that cabin again. When I was 11 years old, my father decided that we should take a summer trip together. I was still in elementary school, but it was July, so I was on break. My dad was usually tied up with work, but he always scheduled his vacation to match mine so we could spend time together. Back then, I would spend most of my free time indoors playing video games, so my dad wanted to do something that would get me outside. That's why he rented a cabin in a secluded area, thinking it would be a good way to pull me away from the screen. It was just the two of us, and I actually looked forward to spending time out in nature. I wasn't upset about it or anything because I liked hanging out with my dad. We drove to the cabin in his work truck. He was a supervisor at a construction firm, and they let him use the truck like it was his own vehicle. It was pretty messy when we got in. He wasn't the most organized, so there were stacks of papers scattered all over the place. The drive was long, and by the time we arrived, most of the day had passed. As we turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, I noticed it stretched on for a couple of miles. I assumed it was private property. On the way there, we passed another truck coming from the opposite direction. My dad waved politely, but I couldn't see who was inside. Shortly after, we reached the cabin. It was decent but very isolated, surrounded by dense trees. It was small but more than enough for the two of us. One thing I remember clearly is the loft where I got to sleep. It was compact and a bit tight, but I thought it was fun at the time. My dad took the only bedroom while I stayed up in the loft. Other than that, the cabin had a tiny kitchen, a couch, and just one proper bedroom. On our first day, we mostly explored the area. I think my dad wanted to teach me about the outdoors since he used to be a guide years ago, though he might have been a little out of practice. In the evening, we decided to make a fire. My dad tried to use an old-school fire bow to start it, but eventually gave up and used a lighter instead. He seemed happy, and so was I, even though I did miss my games a little. We cooked dinner over the fire and talked about different things. My dad shared stories from his childhood, and I listened, feeling closer to him than I had in a while. It was a good day, and before long it was getting late. We went inside, and I climbed up to the loft while my dad stayed on the couch reading a book. The loft was open, so I could see him below with a small lamp providing just enough light to read. I lay in bed, struggling to fall asleep, when I heard a soft knock on the front door. It was quiet but distinct enough that I knew it wasn't just the wind. I looked down at my dad, and I could tell he heard it too. He lifted his head from his book, his face suddenly serious. Slowly, he got up and walked to the door, listening carefully. He didn't say anything or open it. After a while, he turned off the light and sat back on the couch, still holding his book. I eventually drifted off to sleep. In the morning, I woke up to find my dad still on the couch, sitting upright, asleep. I climbed down and wandered around the cabin for a bit before going over to wake him. The moment his eyes opened, he told me we had to leave. His face was tense, and I could tell something was wrong. I asked what was going on, but he just told me not to worry. I figured it had something to do with whatever happened the night before. If there was some stranger lurking around, it made sense that he'd want to get out of there quickly. My dad packed our things in a rush, skipping breakfast. As soon as we stepped outside, I saw that his truck had been completely wrecked. The tires were slashed, and the windows were smashed in. I froze, staring at the damage. "What happened?" I asked, but my dad didn't answer. He just shook his head, looking unsettled. He walked over to the truck and pulled out a bunch of crumpled papers. I assumed they were important for his job. I asked if anything was missing, but again, he didn't respond. With no way to drive out, we had no choice but to walk back to the main road. The idea of walking through the woods made me uneasy, but my dad stayed calm, which helped me do the same. We stuck to the dirt path leading away from the cabin. It felt like an endless walk, especially since I kept glancing around, worried that whoever did this to the truck was still lurking nearby. My dad kept a fast pace, and I stayed close to him even as my legs grew tired. After about an hour, we finally reached the main road. My feet ached, but seeing the paved highway was a relief. We stood there, waiting and hoping for a car to pass. Eventually, a pickup truck came into view. My dad waved it down, and an older man pulled over, asking if we needed help. My dad gave him a brief version of our situation, and the man offered to drive us to the nearest town. During the ride, the driver and my dad talked, but my dad didn't share many details about the night before. I could tell he didn't want to discuss it in front of me. When we reached town, the driver dropped us off at a small diner so we could call for help. We thanked him, and he wished us well before driving off. My dad called the police first, then arranged for a tow truck to get us home. While we sat in the diner waiting, I finally asked him what had happened. He looked at me seriously and admitted he wasn't sure. He said he didn't hear anything after the knock on the door, but at some point he must have fallen asleep. After it was all over, we never really talked about it again. For a while, I wondered if someone had targeted us for some reason. Maybe it had something to do with my dad's work papers. But as I got older, I realized that probably wasn't the case. My dad was important at his job, but he wasn't some big executive. Those documents wouldn't have meant much to anyone else. More likely, it was just some disturbed person or maybe a bunch of reckless teenagers. We never found out for sure if it was the same truck we passed on the way in, but given how few people were out there, that seems like the most likely explanation. I was out for a late evening stroll when I happened upon a trail I had never noticed before. I take walks quite often, usually around my neighborhood, but sometimes I like to explore different areas I haven't seen yet. A few miles from my home, there's a large park I visit occasionally. It's pretty big, and I'm sure there are plenty of trails I still haven't come across. As I wandered through the park, I spotted an opening to a trail that I had never seen before. It caught my attention, and before I knew it, I found myself following the path to see where it led. It was already getting late, probably a little past 7 in the evening. Because of that, I didn't plan on going too far. The park had a closing time, and I wasn't too keen on being alone in the woods after dark. After walking for a while, I strayed from the path and started exploring a different section of the area. I must have walked over a mile before I realized it was time to turn back. The daylight was fading quickly, and I didn't want to risk getting lost. Just as I was about to head back, I spotted a cabin in the distance on my left. I'm not sure what drew me toward it, but something compelled me to take a closer look. I'm glad I did. That night turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. What happened next was something straight out of a horror film. As I got closer to the cabin, it felt like the sky was getting darker by the second. In the back of my mind, I knew I should have turned around, but my curiosity got the best of me. I started wondering how far I had walked. It seemed like I had wandered onto private land. This wasn't a campground, it was just a regular park. I had been coming to this park since I was a child, and I had never known there was a cabin out here. It was the last thing I expected to find. At first glance, I couldn't tell if anyone lived there or if it had been abandoned for years. The place looked like it hadn't been maintained in a long time. I cautiously circled the cabin, keeping a safe distance, probably around 20 feet, just in case someone was nearby. Then, out of nowhere, a loud banging noise shattered the silence. It sounded like someone was pounding on something. The sound startled me, and my first instinct was to run. But something told me to stay and find out what was happening. I edged my way to the back of the cabin, and that's when I saw her. A girl around my age was trapped in the basement. She was pounding on the window and screaming for help. I couldn't make out everything she was saying, but it was clear she was in serious trouble. Without hesitation, I ran to the window and tried to open it. But then, she suddenly looked at me with wide, terrified eyes and pressed a finger to her lips, signaling for me to be quiet. I understood immediately. Realizing I wasn't going to get the window open, I knew I had to act fast. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but I had no service. Panic started to rise in my chest. I pressed my phone against the glass and typed in my notes app, "Are you in danger?" She nodded. I typed again, "Is anyone else here?" She hesitated, then shrugged, indicating she didn't know. I whispered through the glass that I would get her out. I ran to the front door and tried the handle as quietly as I could. Locked. I checked all the windows around the house, but every single one was sealed shut. My heartbeat pounded louder with each second. Desperation kicked in, and I darted into the woods, searching for something to break a window with. After a few minutes, I found a heavy rock. I sprinted back and showed it to the girl. I gestured for her to step back. I threw the rock as hard as I could. The window shattered. She immediately reached out her hands, and I tried to pull her through. But it was no use, the opening was too small. I had no choice. I had to go inside. I ran to another window, used the rock again, and shattered the glass. I hesitated for only a second before climbing inside. I grabbed the first knife I saw in the kitchen, just in case. Then I quickly searched every room. No one was there. I rushed down to the basement. That's when I saw the full extent of her nightmare. She was locked in a small metal cage, maybe 5 feet by 8. She was barely dressed, covered in bruises, dried blood, and scars. She had been held captive by a man who tortured her, starving her, abusing her in every way imaginable, and forcing her to take drugs. I scanned the basement, searching for something to break the lock. A sledgehammer caught my eye. I grabbed it and forced the lock open. The girl was so weak she could hardly stand. I threw an old pair of shoes on her feet and helped her out of the basement. We moved as fast as we could toward the road. As we stepped off the porch, headlights appeared in the distance. The girl, her name was Rachel, whispered frantically. She was sure it was him. We didn't wait to find out. We hurried into the woods, hiding ourselves from sight. We managed to get away before he reached the cabin. I have no idea how long it took him to realize she was gone. I drove her straight to the hospital, where she told the police everything. I stayed with her as long as I could until I knew she would be safe. I never had the chance to give a full statement, and I have no idea where she is now. That was over 2 years ago. I hope she has healed. I hope she has found peace. As for me, I still have nightmares about that night. I never found out what happened to the man who did this to her. The week after it happened, my fiancé and I were in the middle of moving out of state. For all I know, he could still be out there, doing God knows what. Charlie, Bill, and Hank are 3 of the most consistent visitors at the cinema where I've worked as an usher for the past 5 years. In fact, they show up every single day, something even our most dedicated regulars don't manage. How is that possible? Well, Charlie, Bill, and Hank aren't ordinary customers. They're the 3 ghosts haunting this place. I'll go through them one by one, from least to most troublesome. If there's any silver lining to dealing with this many ghosts, it's that they haven't caused anyone harm yet. Annoying? Absolutely. Dangerous? Not so far. First, there's Hank. His story is the saddest because he's the only one whose origins we know. His full name is Grandpa Hank, and the story goes that sometime in the late 90s or early 2000s, an elderly man came to watch a horror movie but never made it out. The cleaning crew found him after the credits had rolled. I have no clue how no one noticed during the film, but that's not the weirdest part. The strangest thing is that no one remembers exactly where he passed. Some longtime staff say it was Theater 3, others claim Theater 6, and some insist it was Theater 11. Regardless, if you enter a theater after a screening, there's a chance Hank is there too. Despite his tragic past, Hank is the least disruptive. He doesn't interact with people, though he does make his presence known. If you ever get the intense feeling of being watched while alone in a theater, that's Hank. Sometimes you might see him in the corner of your eye, just a shadowy figure seated quietly. But the moment you turn to look, he's gone. Over time, I've learned that the best way to keep things calm with Hank is to greet him when opening and closing for the day. A simple good morning, Hank, and good night, Hank, seems to keep him from being too unsettling. Then there's Bill. Bill is a bit more of a nuisance. No one knows where he came from, but he got his name from a certain grumpy puppet on a kids' show because of where he hangs out, the trash hallway. That's where we keep the garbage bins before taking them out at night. Every now and then, Bill gets in a mood and moves the cans around. I've even seen it happen. One time, I tossed a trash bag into a bin, and another can behind me rolled forward on its own before stopping. It never stops being irritating to walk in and find trash bins scattered everywhere, sometimes with garbage all over the floor. But that's not all. Bill also messes with the service elevator in the back hallway. Occasionally, while I'm dumping a trash bag, I'll hear the elevator activate and come up. We're on the 2nd floor, so it makes no sense for it to do that. And every time, the doors open, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps stepping out. Now, you might think, You work in a movie theater? Couldn't it just be sound from a film? Nope, it's always two distinct, deliberate footsteps on the concrete floor. Sometimes they get closer, as if someone is about to turn the corner into the hallway where the bins are. But right before they reach me, they stop. As far as I know, there's no way to stop Bill from acting up. Saying good morning or good night to him doesn't do much. Like the puppet he's named after, he's just a permanent grump. Lastly, we have Charlie. To put it bluntly, Charlie is just a menace. Like Bill, I don't know where he came from, and I have no clue why he's called Charlie. But he is the source of all sorts of problems. Pipes suddenly bursting despite being fine moments before, paper towels vanishing from dispensers seconds after being refilled, lights flickering once during a film before shutting off again, and much more. My most unforgettable experience with Charlie happened around Christmas 2022. We usually have a large cardboard standee set up near the ticket podium where customers scan their tickets. One night I was training a new hire, and we were chatting about all the weird stuff that happens here. Things had been quiet for a while, so she casually said something like, "Ghosts? Yeah, I don't believe in those." Right then, the standee toppled over, and it wasn't just a flimsy piece of cardboard. It was one of those thick, heavy ones that take real effort to set up. "Did you do that?" she asked, assuming I was trying to scare her. I shook my head. I knew how hard those things were to move, and doing so on purpose would have probably gotten me fired. "I see you've met Charlie," was all I could say. There was no one else in the lobby, and the ceiling vent couldn't have knocked it over. That girl didn't last long after that. Maybe another shift or two. I was told she missed a shift, but I have a feeling Charlie had a hand in her leaving. She wasn't the only one. Several people have quit after just a day or two, and the rumor around the theater is that Charlie had something to do with it. I'm still here, though, and as long as I am, I know Hank, Bill, and Charlie will be, too. Maybe the next time Charlie floods the bathrooms or Bill messes with the elevator again, I'll have another story to tell. The story I'm about to tell you happened to my dad and his brother. You see, my dad, who we'll call Jay, was a truck driver, and his younger brother, L, was riding along with him on a long-haul trip during his break from school. Back then, they were both pretty young. My dad was 23 and L was 17. On the third day of their trip, they entered Arizona right around dusk. About an hour later, my dad mentioned that he wanted to stop at the next rest area, and his brother agreed. Checking the map, they saw there was one about 3 miles ahead. As they neared the stop, Elle suddenly pointed outside and said, "Check that out. That's a huge coyote." My dad glanced over and was taken aback. "Whoa, that thing's massive," he said as the creature disappeared into the small wooded area they were passing. When they pulled into the rest stop, my dad noticed it was nearly deserted. A strange uneasiness crept over him, making him regret leaving his gun at home. "I gotta go real bad," Elle said, hopping out of the truck and heading to the bathrooms across the lot. Meanwhile, my dad quickly set up his bed in the back and changed into his sleepwear. As he was climbing in, Elle came sprinting back, yanked the door open, jumped inside, and locked it behind him. "Whoa, what's wrong?" my dad asked. Nothing, man," Elle replied, a little out of breath. I heard something moving in the bushes near the bathroom." He quickly got into his sleepwear and climbed into the top bunk. Later that night, my dad slept soundly, but Elle kept waking up. He kept hearing something, light tapping sounds circling the truck, like claws clicking against a wooden floor. After a few times of this, he gave up trying to figure it out and shoved his pillow over his ears, finally drifting off. By morning, my dad woke to the bright Arizona sun. He got up, went to the restroom to clean up, and when he returned to the truck, something caught his eye. Scratch marks across the passenger door, as if an animal had dragged its claws across it. As he packed up his things, he lit a cigarette and waited for Elle, who eventually stepped out of the truck, groggily mumbling a morning before heading to the bathroom. When Elle returned, he also noticed the scratches. "You see this?" he asked. "Yeah," my dad answered. "We'll just get it repainted later." They continued their trip, stopping at a gas station to grab some snacks before passing through a small town without incident. A while later, about halfway to a place called Clear Creek, they pulled over to relieve themselves. Just as they climbed back into the truck, a distant howl echoed from the trees. They didn't stick around. They jumped in, started the engine, and sped off. Not long after they passed Clear Creek, on an empty stretch of road, Elle asked if he could take the wheel. My dad agreed, so they pulled over to switch. As they did, something heavy slammed against the trailer. Then, they both heard it, an eerie growl, followed by a voice that seemed to say, "Ow!" Without thinking, my dad threw the truck into gear and floored it. Whatever hit the trailer was now running alongside them, matching their speed, even as the truck pushed past 80 miles per hour. The thing then shifted, going from 4 legs to 2, and started moving even faster. In the glow of the headlights, they could make out fur and long, powerful legs like a wolf or a coyote. But the tail was all wrong. Then, it turned its head toward them, its eyes gleaming as it let out an unearthly screech. A twisted mix of a wolf's howl, a woman's scream, and the death cry of a rabbit. The fear that gripped my dad and Elle at that moment was beyond words. Just as they were about to hit the creature, it leaped onto the hood, clawing at the engine bay. My dad slammed the horn. With a shriek, the thing jumped off, only for the truck to roll right over it. My dad didn't let up on the gas. The truck roared past 100 miles per hour in a desperate attempt to escape. Somewhere behind them, in the distance, they heard that same terrifying scream. They made it out safely. The rest of the trip, thankfully, was uneventful. When they finally delivered their load in Dallas, they were bombarded with questions about the damage to the truck. Instead of dealing with another long drive back, they convinced their dad to buy them plane tickets home to Portland. When their dad asked what had happened, they just shook their heads and kept quiet. To this day, they barely speak of that night. Back when I was 26, my sister Anna and I planned a hiking trip together. We both loved being outdoors and figured it would be a great way to spend a weekend. We lived in different towns, but we were only about 2 hours apart, so meeting up wasn't too difficult. We picked a well-known trail in a large forest reserve a few hours away from my place. It was a Friday morning when we set off. Since her town was along the way, I drove to pick her up. By the time I reached Anna, it was around midday, meaning we still had plenty of time ahead of us. As the city faded into thick, green forest, I felt the excitement build. We were planning to spend 2 nights in the wild with no strict plans, just going wherever we felt like. The trails in that area stretched for miles, and even if you spent years exploring, you wouldn't see everything. That being said, we weren't careless. We had a map and a GPS to make sure we stayed on track. When we arrived, we parked in a lot near a small building, which seemed to be an old visitor center. It was empty as usual. The hike started off great. The weather was perfect, and the woods were calm. For the first couple of hours, we were still in an area where many hikers went. We saw families and older folks along the trail, which slowed us down a bit, but we didn't mind too much. We took occasional breaks to take pictures and chat. By sunset, we found a good clearing to set up camp for the night. The next morning, we woke up early and covered a lot of ground. We decided to follow a path we hadn't taken before. By noon, we had left the busy part of the trail behind and hadn't seen another person in a while, which was exactly what we wanted. A few hours later, we stopped for a break near a small stream to have a late lunch. While we rested, Anna pointed out a narrow, overgrown path leading away from the main trail. She was curious and suggested we check it out. I pulled out the map, but it wasn't marked. When I walked closer, I saw that it was definitely a real path, though it didn't seem to get much use. Both of us were eager to see where it led, so we packed up and started down the narrow trail. The deeper we went, the more overgrown it became. Eventually, it hardly felt like a trail at all. Every now and then, we'd spot a marker, reassuring us that we weren't lost. Anna was excited to keep exploring, and honestly, so was I. After about an hour, we stumbled upon an old, crumbling shack hidden among the trees. There was a small clearing around it, and as we stepped forward, the shack loomed over us. It looked abandoned, with shattered windows and a sagging roof. We circled the building, taking in its eerie appearance. Despite how run down it was, something stood out. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt nearby. They cut through the scattered leaves, proving that someone had been there recently. That made no sense to us since we thought we were deep in the wilderness. The tracks were likely from an ATV rather than a car or truck, but still, it was strange. We peeked through the broken windows but didn't see much inside, just rotting furniture and debris. Clearly, no one lived there, but the fresh tracks made me uneasy. Something about the situation felt off, but at the same time, that only made it more intriguing. What was this place being used for? It wasn't safe to be inside. It looked like it could collapse at any moment. Despite that, our curiosity got the best of us. We decided to go in. The wooden floor creaked beneath our feet, soft and unstable from years of decay. Everything inside was in rough shape except for one thing, a large duffel bag in the corner. It stood out because it was the only thing that looked new. Anna and I exchanged glances, both knowing that someone had hidden it there recently. We probably shouldn't have touched it, but curiosity won again. I walked over to it with Anna right behind me. I crouched down and unzipped the top. The second I saw what was inside, I knew we had to leave immediately. The bag was packed with guns. I didn't take a closer look. I just zipped it back up and whispered to Anna that we needed to run. She hadn't seen what was in the bag, so she was confused at first. But we didn't waste time. We rushed out of the shack and back into the trees. Once we were off the clearing, I felt a bit better, but I was still on edge. What if whoever owned that bag came back? We hiked quickly until we reached the main trail. Only then did we start to calm down. By then, it was getting dark, so we had no choice but to camp one more night. Sitting around the fire, we talked about what we had seen. It seemed obvious that the shack was being used for something illegal. The thought of how lucky we were not to have run into anyone made my skin crawl. All night, I was tense, expecting someone to come looking for us. At sunrise, we packed up and hiked out as fast as we could. It was our last day anyway, but we barely spoke the whole way, too focused on getting out of there. When we reached the trailhead, families and kids were around, enjoying their hikes like nothing was wrong. None of them had any idea what was hidden out in those woods. Of course, we reported what we had found. The police said they would investigate, but when I followed up, they told me there was nothing there. That could only mean one thing: whoever left that bag had come back for it. Even now, Anna and I talk about that day. Every time we get chills remembering what we stumbled into. We've had other adventures in the wilderness, even run into wild animals before, but nothing has ever been as terrifying as realizing the most dangerous thing out there isn't nature, it's other people. When I was 19, my older cousin and a few of his buddies decided to spend a week in the wilderness. We booked a remote cabin through a rental site. It was summertime and we were all on break. I had just graduated and was preparing for college that fall. My cousin and his friends were entering their last year of university. The cabin was a modest, single-story structure with a decent-sized porch in the front. A couple of old rocking chairs sat by the door, making the place feel cozy, like something an elderly couple would enjoy. Beyond the porch, thick woods surrounded us, and the nearest house was a good distance away. One of my cousin's friends, Nick, was the one driving. He had a mid-sized SUV, which we figured would handle the rough terrain well. But as it turned out, the roads were smoother than expected, and even a regular car could have made the trip. The drive took about 5 hours, mostly on highways, but the last stretch was a long dirt road. It was well maintained, though, so we had no trouble. We arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, unloaded our things, and settled in. The cabin had just one bedroom, a pull-out couch, and not much else. I brought a sleeping mat, planning to crash on the floor. The first day was spent getting familiar with the area, walking trails and chatting. My cousin and I took one path deep into the woods, walking for well over an hour before we stumbled upon an old road. It looked abandoned, but there were fresh tire marks on the dirt. It wasn't on our map, which was odd, but we figured someone was still using it. We never saw anyone, though, so we eventually turned back to meet up with the others. That first night, we lit a fire in the pit behind the cabin. I wasn't much of an outdoorsy person, so the experience felt exciting. The sky was so clear, and I saw more stars than I ever had before. The atmosphere was peaceful but eerie, with the occasional rustling in the bushes and the distant hoot of an owl. After a while, we went inside, locked up, and called it a night. By then, it was already past midnight. The next day was more of the same. Some of the guys wanted to check out a nearby lake, so we went there, then ended the night with another fire. That evening, after we went to bed, I started hearing noises outside. I was sleeping on the floor near the back window and could pick up faint rustling sounds. At first, I ignored it, assuming it was the wind, but then the noises grew louder. It sounded like something moving through the brush. My cousin was on the pull-out couch about 10 feet away. He heard it too and figured it was a raccoon or maybe a deer, but I was worried it could be a bear. The noises seemed to be getting closer, and as time passed, I realized I might be the only one still awake. I glanced around and saw that my cousin had already dozed off. I checked my phone, 2 a.m. Then I heard footsteps outside. I had no idea what a bear walking sounded like, so I couldn't be sure what I was hearing. Curious, I shifted to my knees and peeked out the window. There was definitely something outside. It was too dark to make out clearly, but I thought it looked human-shaped. That didn't make sense, though, so I convinced myself it was an animal and tried to sleep. The next morning, I didn't mention what I'd seen, but I was still curious, so I stepped outside to check for tracks. Right where I had seen movement the night before, I found footprints, but they weren't animal prints. They were shoe prints, just like ours. That evening, we had dinner inside. All 4 of us gathered around the small kitchen table. It was getting dark, and we planned to sit around the fire again with some drinks. But just as we finished eating, I glanced out the window and saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure stepped out from the tree line, slowly making its way toward the cabin. We all jumped up, staring through the glass. It was a man. He looked disheveled and walked with an odd limp. He stopped about 20 feet from the porch, just standing there, staring at us. Nick grabbed a flashlight but didn't turn it on. He cautiously stepped onto the porch and called out, "Do you need something?" The man didn't answer. He just stood there, staring. After what felt like forever, he finally turned around and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. We locked every door and window after that. None of us got much sleep, staying up and talking for most of the night. The whole thing was deeply unsettling, not because the man did anything outwardly threatening, but because we all suspected he had been out there the night before. That's what truly disturbed me. The following morning, we packed up and left. None of us wanted to stay another night after that. As we drove away, my cousin sent a message to the cabin owner, letting him know we were leaving early and explaining why. Maybe we were hoping for a refund for the unused nights. The owner responded, saying that nobody else should have been anywhere near the property and that he'd check it out. He refunded us, but we got the impression he wasn't overly concerned. To this day, we have no idea who that man was. Maybe he was just a local messing with us. Maybe he was unwell. But what scared me most was the thought that he had been watching us long before we ever saw him. If he had bad intentions, he could have easily broken in while we slept. We never got answers, and I doubt we ever will. This happened when I was 14 years old, a little over 3 years ago. My friend and I used to play hide and seek outside at night, in the dark. We were allowed to hide anywhere we wanted. There really weren't many restrictions. However, we usually wouldn't wander off too far since we just never felt the need to. One particular night, my friend Jake was the seeker, and I was supposed to hide. I got a little carried away and ran toward the woods, thinking it would be funny and add some excitement to the game. I figured it would take him way longer to find me since we had never played in the woods before. While searching for a hiding spot, I came across an old, run-down cabin that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. As I got closer, I noticed the front door was wide open. That seemed really strange, but my curiosity got the best of me, and I cautiously stepped inside. I was careful, though, since I wasn't entirely sure whether someone might actually be in there. Just because it looked abandoned didn't mean it was empty. Even so, I took the risk, feeling deep down that everything would be fine. I found my way into one of the bedrooms and stayed there for about 10 minutes before I started getting pretty bored. I hadn't thought about how dull it would be to hide so well that no one could find me. Right as I was about to give up and either reveal myself or find another spot, I peeked out the window, and that's when I saw it. A dark figure was approaching the cabin. I couldn't tell if it was Jake, but just in case, I quickly ducked under the window so I wouldn't be spotted. I held my breath and did my best to stay completely still, making sure not to make a single sound. The footsteps got closer and closer. I could hear twigs snapping and leaves crunching under every step. Soon, it sounded like whoever it was had reached the window. Then, all of a sudden, the loudest banging sound I had ever heard echoed through the room. I nearly screamed because it startled me so badly. At first, I thought Jake was just messing with me, and honestly, I was more annoyed than amused. He pounded on the glass 4 or 5 more times, but when I finally peeked up to confront him, he was gone. I started calling out Jake's name, telling him this wasn't funny, but before I could say much else, I heard the front door slam open. Someone was coming inside. That freaked me out even more because I had closed the door behind me when I entered. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the wooden floor as they made their way toward the room I was hiding in. My heart was racing because, at that moment, I began to question if it was even Jake at all. I glanced out the window again, and that's when I saw someone standing there with a flashlight. My stomach dropped. That's when it hit me. Whoever had just entered the cabin wasn't Jake, because Jake was outside, standing right there in front of me. Without thinking, I yanked the window open and jumped out, not even caring about how I landed. Luckily, I hit the ground on my feet without getting hurt. Jake aimed his flashlight at me as I took off running. I didn't waste a single second. I bolted straight home, shouting for Jake to follow me, yelling that there was a man inside the cabin where I had been hiding. First, Jake didn't believe me. He must have thought I was trying to prank him because he hesitated before running. But that changed the moment he saw the man for himself, peering out of the same window I had just been hiding near. His head was tilted forward, eyes locked on Jake. Once we made it back to my house, I told Jake everything that had happened. He believed me completely. He had no reason not to after what he saw. We didn't tell my parents, though. Technically, I probably shouldn't have been hiding in that cabin in the first place. I definitely learned my lesson that night. I've never done anything that reckless since. Looking back, I'm just grateful that nothing worse happened and that I managed to get away safely. This happened in Montana in the late 90s when I was in my early teens during the middle of winter. My family and I lived in a cabin far out in the forest. When I say far, I mean the closest store or house was at least a 30-minute drive away. It was around 10:30 at night, and my dad was working the night shift, so it was just me and my mom at home. Everything was normal until things took a terrifying turn. We had just finished dinner, and my mom was wiping down the table when she asked me to do the dishes. I agreed, and as I was waiting for the cold water to warm up, I noticed that the outside lights suddenly went out. My reflection in the window, combined with the darkness, made it hard to see, but I could make out what looked like a face. Someone, or something, was staring straight at me. I froze, feeling my stomach drop. I grabbed a rag and wiped the fog off the window to get a better look. Just as I moved the rag away, a blinding light shone directly at me. I had to squint and turn away because it hurt my eyes. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the light shut off, and I could make out the shadowy figure standing in the distance, still watching me. My mom placed the last of the dishes in the sink, snapping me out of my daze. I stepped back from the window, and she noticed something was off. She asked me what was wrong, and I told her about the figure outside and how they had shined a flashlight at me. First, she didn't believe me. She thought I was joking. I insisted I was serious and couldn't understand how she didn't see the light. She must have had her back turned at that moment. She dismissed it and didn't even bother checking. Feeling uneasy, I cautiously went back to the window and peered outside. The figure was gone. That gave me a small sense of relief until I heard the doorknob start to rattle. Someone was trying to turn it, attempting to get inside. My mom screamed, and we both grabbed small kitchen knives. The person outside then started pulling on the door even harder and kicking it, making it clear they were trying to force their way in. But we got lucky. My dad arrived home at just the right moment. His boss had let him leave work early that night, and if that hadn't happened, I don't know if my mom and I would still be here. The second my dad's truck pulled into the driveway, the man took off. But my dad didn't hesitate. He grabbed his Glock 19 and fired 5 shots, hitting his mark each time. The intruder collapsed and died within minutes. After making sure the threat was gone, my dad immediately drove us to the police station to file a report. The authorities investigated and determined it was an act of self-defense. My dad wasn't charged with anything. It was clear that the man had been trying to break into our home, and when officers searched him, they found a concealed handgun, a 6-inch knife, a can of mace, and a pair of handcuffs. I don't even want to think about what his intentions were. It still makes me sick to imagine what could have happened if my dad hadn't come home when he did. A few months later, we moved out of that cabin. My dad and some of his friends helped build us a new house, and we lived there for about 6 years before I eventually moved out with my girlfriend. Now, we have our own apartment and life has been pretty normal. But every once in a while, I find myself telling this story, and every time I do, I get chills all over again.